I'm sure there will be some questions coming up in terms of particularly extensions, but first, Julian, please, on Pool Re.
Thank you, Klaus. So what I thought I'd do is depart from the advertised program and rather than go through Pool Re, just try and pull together some of the threads of what you've heard from these guys and also what you've heard during the rest of the morning. So for the purposes of the next few minutes, all you need to know about Pool Re is that it's a private reinsurance company, it's a mutual, and unlike most pools, it's pre-funded. In other words, we collect premium. So with that, I'll just shoot through really to this slide. And the reason I go to this slide is that I think this is really summarizes what Pool Re is trying to do. And so Pierre-Yves says he's trying to operate at the minimal cost, as are we, but I also exhort my board of directors that actually spending money in some of these areas is actually money well spent for a variety of reasons. And I'll explain what those are. So one is the proposition. You've heard that all of these pools are about property damage and business interruption. You've also heard this morning that the threat has changed substantially, and therefore the proposition needs to change substantially. You've heard about denial of access, non-damage business interruption, contingent business interruption, cyber terrorism. The proposition has to change if the pools are to remain relevant, otherwise they become useless. Expertise. We can't buy reinsurance and we can't sell reinsurance as well if we don't understand the threat. And therefore we have a duty, we feel, to inform and educate the market, whether that's the reinsurance market and whether that's the insurance market who are our customers. And so understanding the threat and the nature of the threat, and everything has changed since our formation in 1993. And therefore, in order to evolve, we need to understand and be experts. I'll come back to risk management. Stakeholder management is extremely important in that we have a variety of stakeholders, from the regulator to the reinsurance community, to the insurance community, to the treasury, who ultimately provide our backing. And what we do has to be in tune with all of those stakeholders. The model hasn't changed since 1993. How many of your companies have got exactly the same operating and business model that you had 25 years ago? We need to adapt our model, and that brings me on to international, and that's what I learn from these guys. A lot of this IFTRIP is about collaboration and learning from each other, and I think that is part of what we get from each other as we look at Pool Re to innovate in our model. A lot of what we may well do in the future, we've learned from these guys. So I finish on that slide with risk management. Really, risk management is about the fact that if you're sitting, as we are, as a non-profit making organization, we collect the premiums, and those premiums are to pay future losses. But actually, when you're sitting on £6.25 billion plus an additional £2 billion worth of reinsurance, it's very difficult to just sit on that money and do nothing with it. And I think risk management and taking the fight against terrorism up the curve is something that we have begun to invest quite heavily in, with collaboration with the security services, with the Home Office, so that we can understand the threat, but also change the behavior of the consumer by giving the consumer incentives in terms of premium reduction. If they implement protective security improvement activity, we then give them a reduction in their premium. If I look at the objectives, I think really just the one thing I'd pick out of here is that we are the private market's friend. We're not in competition with the private market. In fact, I would say Pool Re's done more to stimulate the private market in the last 3 or 4 years than at any time in our history. The purchase of £2 billion worth of reinsurance, the looking at things like the ILS market and what we might be able to do there, increasing member retention so that the members have more skin in the game, I think is all testament to that. But if you look at what's happening in the world of terrorism that you've heard about already this morning, I don't believe that the pool should act in isolation. I think the pool should work with the private market to see what the most efficient way of closing that gap that you've heard about, particularly in this instance, and I'll talk about it in a minute, non-damage business interruption, is. And it may well be that the pool facilitates, acts as a conduit to closing that gap, but that the private market then lines up behind the pool to actually reinsure that risk. So you get an efficient way of closing the gap as opposed to a piecemeal way of closing the gap. Somebody talked this morning about climate change, pandemic, mass migration. Why wouldn't you use that same model in terms of creating new insurance markets by using the collaboration between academia, and you've heard from academia today, You've heard from government, or you shortly will hear from government. You've heard from the insurance market, and you've heard from a variety of different pooling mechanisms. Of course, Dirk is excluded from that. Those collaborations between all of those parties is the only way you are going to translate solutions for these currently uninsurable or very difficult to insure risks, not to mention the 80% of tangible economy that somebody mentioned also. The private market harnessing, I think I've already talked about, and I think it's a really important theme that I don't want to lose. But in the interest of time, I'm going to flick forward to just talk about what's happened in London to close. You've got a number of things going on that I think, again, we have to address. What is the definition of terrorism? The Lint Cafe that Chris mentioned, where the chap put up the ISIS flag that turned out not to be the ISIS flag, or it was the wrong ISIS flag. Is he inspired by terrorism? Is he a terrorist? Is he a member of a terrorist organization? Was he directed by terrorists? What is going to be the definition of terrorism? And of course, last week we had Finsbury Park Mosque attack in UK, which was a right-wing extremist. So the definition of terrorism is very, very different to when, certainly in the UK, you had card-carrying members of the IRA or card-carrying members of Baader Meinhof or Red Brigade. It's a very, very different world today, and that definition of terrorism is going to create precedent unless we deal with it up front. The 4 losses that we've suffered in the last 3 months, you can see there, each give rise to something very different. Westminster, in a sense, was rock and a hard place. If the government did not declare it as terrorism, the insurance market, the property insurance market, would have paid out on the basis of denial of access under a standard property policy. Once it was declared terrorism, the property market exclusion kicked in, but Pool Re does not cover business interruption that does not emanate from property damage. And so you end up with a very, very clear manifestation of a terrorism insurance gap. Manchester, clear case of the Pool Re classic type loss, but London Bridge, same thing again, where you've ended up, one, with criticism of the government for failing to certify very quickly. And I talk to my American colleagues, and they often say it would take them a long time to certify something. Our government is under huge pressure at the moment for failing to certify something in a 2-week period. Finsbury Park, right-wing extremism, is that terrorism? What's the difference between mental illness and terrorism? And then the other thing that, of course, has arisen is the fact that motor insurance policies, I think it was questioned earlier this morning, motor insurance policies provide unlimited liability. So are those motor insurers pricing for the fact that somebody might hire a vehicle and drive it into a crowd of people? I doubt very much that they are. So these are the kinds of things that we are faced with in the pooling industry. These are the kinds of things that we discussed yesterday at the closed session. And I think these are things that can only be solved in discussions between ourselves, academia, government, and the private insurance market. Thank you, Klaus.
Thank you.